tarde. Estamos aqui desta feita para mais uma das lições do projeto Lessons, desta vez com a professora Giuliana Bruno, que vem da Universidade de Harvard, e eu, sem mais delongas, vou começar por perguntar quem é a professora. Professora, Professor Giuliana Bruno, thank you very much for accepting our invitation. It's a great honor to have you here and have a such distinct researcher and intellectual worldwide. At the first, I used always to follow the Hannah Arendt dictum that we should ask who you are. Who are Giuliana Bruno?
Thank you very much. First of all, I'm very happy to be here. Who am I? Well, I'm an Italian intellectual, cultural theorist who's interested in visual studies and who teaches at Harvard University. I moved to New York many years ago and started teaching at Harvard about 20 years ago. And I write on the intersection between architecture, the visual art, and film.
Very well, Professor Bruno, I want to begin by asking you about your research. Your work revolves, as you have been saying, in the world of visual art, or should I say material art, and architecture, cinema, but it deals as well with the quite unique scientific perception of space, I would say. Is it an anthropogeographic series of interdisciplinary possibilities of cultures and its spatial memories, your fundamental, the grounding of your work? Or could one say that methodologically you are an anthropologist of space?
That's a very nice description. I think you said it in your own words better than I could. Yes, I'm interested in space in every possible way. In some way, I think that the way in which, in a sense, space can be depicted in paintings, in moving images, by architecture itself, sometimes literature as well. So in a sense, is to me a kind of an exploration of different ways in which one can understand perspectives on space and their relation to representation. So my work is very interdisciplinary in nature, because in some way I look at space as a kind of also depository of memories, as a place that retains the traces of history and also the traces of narratives and of the stories, and how the surface of the space itself, in a sense, is layered with everything that might have happened in that space over the course of time. That has taken, over the course of my research, different kinds of paths, so to speak. I started off with my first book, Street Walking on a Ruined Map, being a kind of cartographer, but a cartographer of something very close to me. I wrote about the city that I'm from, Naples, in Italy, and I could only have written about it having left it. So it was, in a sense, a perspective that had a kind of anthropology of distance and intimacy connected to it at the same time. And I wanted to write about the city through the eyes of a woman filmmaker, a pioneer of film, Elvira Notari, who made films between 1906 and 1930, about 60 feature films and over 100 documentaries, and was forgotten by history. In the 1,500 pages history of Italian cinema, she has one footnote. So I thought somehow that this voice had to be heard, and especially because she herself was filming the city on location. So everyone thinks of neorealism as being the first time we actually see real cities, but in fact this woman had been filming the city as it was. So it was anthropological in a sense that it was a document of a place at a particular moment in time, and looked at from the eyes of a woman filmmaker who was literally kind of remaking the cultural history of the city in their own narratives. So there was a sense in which I kind of became a strange anthropologist, because anthropologists usually write about very far away places, but I felt much closer to the idea that in some way it's harder and more interesting to write an anthropology of something that's very close to you. And instead of looking at the other and looking at yourself through the eyes of another. So there was that sense in which my first book is, in a way, a documentation of a history, and also a documentation of the way in which a place can be read through moving images. And that has remained, in a sense, a constant over the course of time. The geographical aspect is important to me. My major book, Atlas of Emotion, has journeys in art, architecture, and film, has the geography even in its title, has the first one had map and atlas. And there, it really is an atlas. In some way, the first book was a micro-history. So it took a city, it looked at it from several different perspectives, the way in which this woman filmed it on location, how she drew from the spaces of literature, what had happened to the city at the moment in which she emerged in time, in history, in film, photography, medical history. So I had several layers, but they were all around and about one city. With Atlas of Emotion, the geography exploded. In some way, it really is an atlas in a sense that it wanted to encompass a much larger perspective. And I started off with one map, which is called La Carte du Pays de Tendre, the map of the land of tenderness, 1654. It was drawn by Madeleine de Scudéry, and it's a very peculiar map because it's a map of an interior landscape. So it purports to, in a sense, to create a geography of something that's not physical, that you cannot touch or see, but at the same time touches our lives. And so I took that model, in a sense of geography, to then traverse ways in which the relation between the exterior landscape and the interior landscape can be portrayed in different ways in which both architecture, the visual arts, and film constructed. So, again, there is this sense in which, in a way, a geography of space and a construction of space is all over my books, and all the way to the last one, Surface, which has in its very title, every kind of possible surfaces.
And still on this subject of anthropology and of fiction and anthropology, there is this genre of filmmaking anthropology. It's ethnofiction, most popularized by Jean Rouch, and it has its deep roots here in Portugal and Portuguese filmmakers, from Oliveira to Ricardo Costa, and far beyond. In Leitão de Barros in the 1930 was already filming in this kind of aesthetic and fictional experience. And I must ask you this a little bit more personal question about your own writing. And I will just briefly quote Ballard. We live in a world ruled by fictions of every kind. The fiction is already there. The writer's task is to invent reality. And I quite feel you're doing this through your work. Do you think your role as a cultural theorist is to write or rewrite reality?
Wonderful question. Also, fiction is very important to me, or as a theorist, and that could seem like a contradiction. Many theorists think or think of themselves as writing objective histories, or something that has to do with interpreting the real and rendering as it is. And I write more like a novelist. There's something about the way in which I like to suggest something through the form itself of writing, so that I don't think that academics should have no interest in the style in which they write, or necessarily just write in ways that want to demonstrate something. I like to suggest things by the way in which I involve the reader themselves into interpreting and imagining worlds. So the idea of geography is also a form of imagination of worlds, and that's the way I approach my subject. When I see it, when I can feel it and touch it, is a way of entering into it, and also kind of inventing some parts and rendering it clear. I've always learned something interesting from Michel Foucault, who said about history that the problem is that objectivity doesn't exist. The question is making clear the subjective point of view out of which you speak or write. So to me, that's the perspective, in a sense, is that I take the reader on a journey, and I make it clear that it is a journey that it's kind of my journey that in that respect traverses territories, and those territories are rendered with very scholarly research, but that there is an aspect of this that can only be made by way of making certain associations and using a form of writing that is seductive and haptic, if the object itself is so. So it depends a lot on the object on which I write, and the writing sort of follows that in some way. And I mean, certainly for my first book, that was a choice. I was confronted with this woman filmmaker who made 60 feature films and over 100 documentaries, but only 3 existed. So what does a writer do? You know, do you try to reconstruct everything? How do you reconstruct? Do you just write on the 3 films that exist? I thought that was boring, you know, that the whole idea would be, in a sense, to make the reader understand what had been missing and why it was lost. So it became more of an archaeological journey to try to dig out the terrain, and by way of association, trying to understand what might the stories be like. So going to the sources of literature, finding the paintings or the photographs, the world that this woman filmmaker was sourcing or seeing, and how she was interpreting it. And I didn't want to resurrect her. That was not the point. I wanted to be clear that it was also a kind of a dialogue between somebody who had died and who was forgotten, and a researcher who was trying to, not to say the reality of what she was, but interpreting, in a sense, her world, and also using a part of my imagination for that. And so, in a sense, you know, had she not existed, I might have invented her. It was almost too good of a reality for her to exist. And so I always think that in a way that's an important part of writing. I learned a piece of that from an Italian art historian who's not very well known as much as she should be, Anna Banti, who wrote a book on Artemisia Gentileschi. Mm-hmm. It was one of the few most important Baroque painters, the daughter of Orazio Gentileschi. And it was a pioneer study about this woman's work, and she wrote during the Second World War, and her house was bombed and the manuscript perished with it. And this was before there were photocopies or computers or files, and so she felt so compelled about the subject that she wrote it again. And we don't know what the first book was like, but the second book is a meditation on writing and totally fictional. And the dialogue with Artemisia is, in a sense, a kind of dialogue that comes from the encounter between these 2 women in history. And I thought it was a very interesting way to write and to think about it. You know, to also make sure, as a researcher, I often do this to sort of make the reader understand also what it means to do something. So there are moments when you stop or you pause and you actually interject yourself personally with a voice that makes the reader understand what kind of process this one goes through as one writes. So to me, it's not just the object of writing, but also the subject and the subjective point of view that comes in together. And then there's also the different kinds of layers of the type of work that I approach.
You were saying reading, and it's a concept I want to grab now. We owe to Foucault the idea of the world as a book to be read. Mm-hmm. Is this process of reading for the reader and a form of haptic perception? Mm-hmm. for you? You feel the reader of books is the same as the reader of architecture, or as the reader of the world as it is.
Yes, yes. I mean, I'm very passionate about architecture. Architecture plays a very, very important part in my work as part of space, but I also think of books themselves as being this tangible object that is indeed traversed. And physically, but also virtually. So there's something about the process of reading that is, it's a journey through a space, and it's a journey through time. And in some way, architecture offers the very same experience, or a very similar experience. One of the older ideas about architecture was that it didn't move. Well, of course, buildings don't move, right, in theory. But in practice, they are activated. And they can only be read as they are activated by motion through space. So that's one of the main points that I make in Atlas of Emotion, is that motion and emotion go together, or that there is a kind of movement through space that activates, attracts one, and makes also read the space itself. So you cannot really ever understand the space if you have not had a habit of tangibly really possessing it or living it, in similar ways in which one can actually touch a book or have forms of imagination as one traverses as a journey. So this notion of the haptic journey, or the idea of hapticity as being something tangible but also that puts you in touch with a particular space, or makes you make a journey or a traversing through it, really, to my mind, connects the way in which we read the world, and we read books, and we also read forms of architecture.
But do you think cinema was crucial to create this grid of apprehension of the world, or it was already there?
In Atlas of Emotion, the journey to me started earlier than cinema. So there's two ways of thinking about it. One is that there was cinema always before cinema, which is one perspective, and another is to say that that in a way cinema picked up on other aspects. So to my mind, obviously, I mean, there is a specificity to the rise of the moving image, and I think in the modernity, this perspective of moving through space became essential for our understanding, our making of the world, and our understanding of the world. So in that respect, I mean, cinema is very important as the cinematic century, so to speak, or the moving image, to the way in which we represent the world, but also imagine it. I mean, I don't think we can no longer think without moving images. It's like even our dreams have now become films. There's something about the framing, the cutting, the sequencing, the perspective, the movement, that is very much part of the way we imagine the world. And that's definitely something that has happened with this relation between space and the moving image with cinema. But I also think that this was not entirely invented by film. So in Atlas of Emotion, I went backwards in time, looking for aspects that may be pre-cinematics, or ways in which the past may have dreamt the future. And I'm using this wonderful expression of Benjamin, who always thought that in some way that the past dreams the future, so that you see traces of something to come. If you're looking backwards, and as the angel of history, looking backwards, projecting forward. So I thought of looking at ways in which this form of mobilization of space, which is very central to my work and the way I think, brought about by the moving image, existed in before cinema in other forms of expression. And so the question is, where did modernity start? If you take it with Manfredo Tafuri, it's the early modernity is even before the Renaissance. And so there's ways in which rethinking in perspective, and rethinking perspective through mobilization of space, one arrives at understanding the moving image. So there were several aspects of this that I traced in Atlas of Emotion. Picturesque gardens. There's some architectural spaces and also landscapes exist to be seen in motion. A garden is not something that you can understand if you just look at it from one singular perspective and don't move through it. The perception of a garden is haptic in the making, and especially the picturesque garden in many different ways. So I traced several forms of mobilization of space that came before cinema, that were parts of early modernity, that in a sense led to this idea of picturing a space, sequencing it, and moving through it, which is the way in which film in some way has then come to fruition as a kind of the art form where all of that is literally connected. But one can really go very, very far back. For example, in Atlas, I talk about a very interesting coincidence. Eisenstein writing a very beautiful, very little known essay on montage and architecture, which was translated in English very late, actually, and in an architectural journal. And film historians had largely really not looked at it. And it's one of the most interesting things he wrote. And he wrote that in a sense that cinema and architecture are very much connected because they both are forms that deal with this movement in space. And interestingly enough, he traced this all the way back to the Acropolis of Athens. And the Acropolis of Athens is a very interesting example because art historians could not really quite understand it, because until they understood that this was a city that was built for views to be seen as one traversed the space. So it's only through that kind of motion that the city itself, the archaeological site, made sense. So in some way, this city was a cinema before cinema, way back before cinema even existed. And Eisenstein makes this point and uses some images that Le Corbusier himself had used without citing. So this is kind of connection of these images of the Acropolis of Athens that both Le Corbusier and Eisenstein used to think in ways that are very similar about these kinds of promenades through space. And Corbusier, of course, is the modern architect who understood la promenade architecturale, the architectural promenade, the essential element of the fact that you move through space in views developed as you do, and that is also very much a quality and of light, and the way in which the light changes makes the space very different. And of course, his windows were fenêtres à longueur, so they were windows that were cut long and which allowed somebody to walk through and showed you the landscape as if it itself was in motion outside the window. So it's a window that's literally a frame and a sequence. So there is another, to me, connection between.
And we thank you very much for Atlas, because it's really, and it's where this sentence of Malevich, how much does it mean to you? Everything that we call substance is nothing but movement. I see that through your work, but now it's.
No, I think it's a good starting point. Do you think that movement or substance is a matter of time? It's a matter of becoming. So I would like to go to your first book and to the subtitle, because I was shocked when I read it in 2002 about the word journeys. Journeys always remind me traveling, wandering around, and the subtitle is Journeys in Art, Architecture and Film. It's an atlas of emotion. So can you dwell a little bit on the notion between the link between movement and emotion?
Yes, the idea of the book was beginning with this map, which is literally a map of motion. So, which was not a static map. It was interesting to me because the map of the tenderness is a map that does not order space and does not make it static, but in fact attempts to do something quite interesting, which is to make a map that would allow one to be taken on a journey and at the same time make a journey as one looks at it. So what was interesting is that in the map there were figures of people that were starting a journey, and it's a journey that goes through a landscape that looks like an exterior landscape, but as you traverse this exterior landscape you realize that something happens inside of you. So and so literally it's trying to make a map of emotion by way of motion. So I thought this was quite an interesting idea in 1654 to try to express, and the map was not closed. So that has no borders. It's a little bit like a frame of cinema where there's a kind of an off-screen space. So you have a sea of enmity, and the only one side is seen, and then there's a river that flows through it and flows out of the map. So there's a kind of sense of movement by way of water, and the only place that does not move is called the Lake of Indifference, because once you're in there, you are stuck. And so there was a geography, in a sense, that expressed the form of motion and also the stillness that comes with the lack of motion, which is also a lack of emotion. So I went back and started looking at the etymology of emotion, which in English is very simple, because you could see in a way that comes from motion with the idea of which is moving out. And moving out also means moving out of oneself. So it's moving out of a certain territory, but also moving out of the self, meaning that in a sense the emotional journey allows you to become. It's a journey of becoming, that also a journey of different states, or changing your own self, or looking at yourself in different kinds of ways. But I was also interested in another idea, which is this moving out is also connected to transit and to migration, to displacement, moving from one place to another. So I thought, well, this is interesting because in a way, it's an idea that's not only personal, but it's also social, and has something to do with the idea of migration as a way of moving out of yourself and creating different identities and finding new ways of looking at yourself and at the world at the same time. So I thought this concept is intimate, but intimate not in a sense that it is individual. It's such an enormous concept that has moved the way in which cultures themselves have moved. And so it's important to think about this idea of the connection between affect and motion, because it affects, in a sense, the way in which cultures themselves have defined themselves against being static and in movement across different kinds of social spaces, and across different kinds of gender spaces, across different kinds of identities. So this notion became a large notion for me to work different ways in which those kinds of cultural movements are affected and affect one. So this connection between affect and motion became very central to the way in which I was tracing something that also, as you were saying, moves across time and in time. Because this is not the movement through space, is also a movement through the layers and the sediments of memories that exist in the space. So a journey is also a journey that could be an excavation, that can be an archaeological journey, or a journey into the future. So it's a form of connecting together, in a sense, affect, space, geography, and time.
So just an ironical question that I would like to put. So the example of Xavier de Maître, the travel inside his own room, for you it's completely put apart.
No, I actually have it in the atlas.
No, I know.
I know that it's an atlas that is sort of comprehensive. Some journeys only happen if one doesn't move. I don't think necessarily that journeying is in fact, some of the best journeys happen when one doesn't move. Cinema, you can only experience it if you kind of sit in a particular way in this chair, motionless, and you let your mind wander. So you do a lot of movement, intellectual movement, affective movement, but it all happens in your head in relation to a screen. But your body, to a certain extent, is completely static. Dreaming, wonderful journeys happen. In dreams, the unconscious liberates itself in many ways, and we need to be still for that. So I think my kind of journey has nothing to do with speed necessarily, or has something to do with speed, because that's an interesting concept, but not all. So yes, the journey around my room is very much part of the book, because that was a fantastic book, and a fantastic way, in a sense, to speak about ways in which forms of imagination can be excited by ways of wandering that are not only physical, but they can happen virtually. And so that's the virtuality of the journey is very much part of the way I think.
Okay, so let me make another question. This because I was now going to the title, because Atlas of Emotion, when I read it, I thought that was one of the most powerful metaphors for the concept of aesthetics. So, and now I see that in your last book you call it surface. If you want to dwell a little bit on this, how an atlas of emotion, a mapping of emotions, now it's calling surfaces, and it tells, in fact, what aesthetic is.
Well, thank you. First of all, it's very nice of you to say that. Titles are an interesting. Some things, sometimes they just begin a process. Sometimes they come in the middle. Sometimes they come at the end. And I mean, when I wrote Street Walking on a Ruined Map, it was such an abstract title. My publisher was really against it and thought I should call it something specific. Then I was going to end up in being understood as a cartographer or somebody who writes about prostitution. And I said, well, if I have to go down to history for this is fine. And I kind of liked the idea of the street walking because it was a form of flânerie. And in a way, I wanted that also to polemically say who can do this walking through space freely. And so the idea has always been very present in it. Atlas of Emotion, for a little while, I thought it would be called Atlas of the Flesh. And then I got really sick of the body thing, and it sort of became clear to me that I actually wanted to try to do something different with it. And well, in my later years, I'm trying to get more and more, in a sense, minimal with the title. I started off with long and then sort of whatever at Atlas, and at some point, this idea of surface seemed to encompass just about everything that I wanted to say. Let me try to explain the connection between the two. Now, the Atlas has different layers, and in a sense, it was an excavation down this way, but horizontal and then vertical at the same time. And a very deep excavation in it, and the process of writing was also extraordinarily complex in trying to go both very far out and at the same time very far down. And at a certain point, certain things came up onto the surface, and I realized, well, a lot of interesting things that in fact can be read on the surface and that happen on the surface. And yet surface has such a negative connotation in our culture. I mean, if you want to say something really horrible to somebody, you say they're superficial. It's kind of like as an insult, right? And I thought, why is that the case? I mean, think of how important surface is. And start this way, the skin. I mean, speaking of reading, we can read everything on the surface of our face. It's a surface. There is a kind of idea that the face itself is a surface, but that there is a facial aspect to everything surface. So the surface is the skin. And like the skin of our body, it reads our history, the lines, the expression, everything that comes up, the symptoms of the way in which we express ideas and thoughts and feelings, they're all read on the surface of the skin. So as well as the history of our own body, the time as it passes through, and all our changes are superficially read. So surface seems to be very important at that point of view. Second, skin, the clothes we wear. We identify ourselves by the way we dress, and we read other people's identities in the way we dress. We can see very often not only the gender, the social, the cultural relation, the stylistic one. So there is a kind of language of fashion that is both personal and universal at the same time. So this second skin is another surface that's extremely important to identify ourselves and to communicate with others. I mean, that's also how we communicate. We communicate through skin, through touch. Haptically, we touch objects and things, and at the same time, in a sense, we communicate and we are in touch with each other by the way in which we can read everything on the surface of textile. Then there is the surfaces of the walls we live in, that all the kind of this pellicular matter that we are surrounded with, and the canvases of the paintings that we look at. And last but not least, the surface of the screen, which are omnipresent in our world. So it's not just cinema, it's the surface of every screen we touch that at this point has become like a kind of, a haptic affair constant. We are attached to whatever technological device that has a screen that we have. So in a way it seemed important to me to defy the idea that surfaces are superficial and to think about how crucial they are to culture in all of these different kind of configurations. And most importantly, I thought, well, what's happening is that a lot of changes are really happening on the surface, and some of these surfaces are changing themselves in the interaction. And so I started looking at the ways in which painters are dealing with the textural materiality of their canvases, of the ways in which painting itself is starting to show not just as a form of representation, but in fact working the surface itself onto which it is seen. And why is it that we haven't thought about the fabric of the screen per se? I mean, a lot of people, when they think of film, they think of the films that are shown. They don't think of the architecture of the screen, and how, in a sense, that changes in the architecture of the screen also changes the way in which we receive a piece of work. So sometimes the surface of the screen is just being looked at as this form that is invisible, but in fact it has a very important function, and so do all the screens that we are looking at. And if you think of the surfaces of the walls, I mean, they're becoming more and more like screens. They're becoming activated in architecture in ways in which the light and the kind of transposition, the transmission of light is becoming a very, very important form of expression that connects together, to my mind, painting to photography, to architecture and film. And so this superficial, in a sense, interaction is, to my mind, defining the modern condition. And in the end, I think the really surface is a very interesting concept, because it is the kind of, is one of the crux of modernity. And so I wanted to really reflect on the idea itself of surface and the way in which all of these art forms intersect. So it's a way for me also to say that surface is what really connects painting to photography, to architecture, to fashion, to film, and to design, to objects of design. After all the things that we are surrounded with, that we sit on, that we use, are all surfaces of touch.
And that touch us as well. And
that touches us as well in return. So that, in a way, I mean, why surface considered superficial if it's such an important part of the way in which we interact with forms of representation and to the world. And so to me, it is also a way of saying that it's that all of these art forms have something in common and also transfer mediums one into each other. So it's another way of, in a sense, of doing my kind of interdisciplinary work, connecting things together. Sometimes, less in a sense this way and more that way.
So, but there is a surface that till now you didn't, and I think you did it on purpose, that you never touched. That's writing. I think that's one of the most powerful surfaces is writing, because it deals with power.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know if you want to say some words about this, because we are talking all about what we see, but of course that we see when we write, but the surfaces of writing have depthness that cannot be seen by our eyes, like a canvas or like a screen or...
Well, it depends. I agree with you. I didn't talk about writing because I talked a lot about writing before. No, that's fine. But,
because it links to the concept that you bring forth in the beginning of our conversation about historicity.
Yes, I mean, I think that you're right, completely right about, but well, let's put it this way: we write on screens now, so there is also when I talk about screens, I'm also talking about writing, because writing itself has changed. I mean, I started off writing by hand, and now, I mean, I take notes, but we mostly writing this way, and the way we're writing this way makes it look invisible, because some of the changes are no longer visible, or visible in different drafts, but they don't make the depth of changes. They're no longer like when you were cutting and pasting and writing on the margins, but it's all in there, in a sense. All this kinds of, in a sense, it's, as you were saying, it's invisible, but also very visible, because one can read it through it. The pros, if writing is interesting writing, you could read all of that forms of layers through it. But there's also, so I think that there is a physicality and a virtuality to forms of writings in their relation to screens. But I'm also interested in the way in which artists use writings to express this idea in a sense of materiality. So when I was talking about canvases, I'm also interested in ways in which text and words are becoming very much part, even if it seems like people have been saying the book is dead for way too long. It's not dead at all. And in fact, the more virtual we go, the more interesting we become in some of the physicality itself of this incredible object of design that allows you to move through different spaces in different times. And so using some of that materiality in a sense of the book or of the writing or the page, I think painting itself is showing the connection between the canvas and the page. And there's another thing that interests me. I wrote about it a lot in Atlas as well, is that people used to write on skin. After all, it was vellum, and maps were drawn in the same way. So, to me, the surface is very deeply related to forms of drawing, and forms of drawing that began with these kinds of writing and continue with cartography, and that I think are becoming very visible in contemporary art as artists are interrogating themselves on the material history of the medium with which they work. And for painters, it's not just canvases, but it is also, in many ways, the kind of the layers of history of the book and of writing. So, as you were asking me the question, I was also thinking about a beautiful work of Anne Hamilton that she showed at the DIA Center for the Arts, in which someone was sitting in this. She had a person sit with a book. In a large space, which was populated by pieces of strings and on the floor, and a person would sit at a table with a book, and she would burn the pieces of writing and the lines one by one. And to me, that was an expression of surface. I mean, how in some ways there was the depth of surface of the writing and the mark of the writing and the erasure, but that the erasure also left a burn, so there was a trace of something that happened in the reading, in a sense, of this particular work. So the surface is also very much about the process of writing.
So do you think that surfaces is the places of scars?
Can also be, yes. It's about an extremely, it's interesting, I would say it's a place of traces more than scars. I mean, scars there are scars. I tend to be less violent when I write. I'm more interested, in a sense, on the idea of something that leaves a mark. And it's a mark of history, and it's also a trace of something that happened that you can read through the surface. Now, the scar is a particular kind. It's interesting also because, in a sense, when you have a scar, it means something has already healed. So, but I tend not to think of hypercuts, although, of course, there's Lucio Fontana and his cuts on the painting. That's very much about surface and about seeing something beyond and through. So, in a way, it's what this this particular surface that is the border, the permeable border between an inside and an outside, makes you read. And how that emerges on the surface, and at the same time how the surface can make you go through inwards. So the sky is an interesting metaphor in that respect, because it joins something together, and it remakes the surface, leaving the trace but tries to remake it whole.
But invention of art was also the invention of the surface, and not only the invention of the inscription.
Yes.
So it's this duality of materiality and the surface.
Yes, I mean that's in a sense what I'm arguing about is in a way the surface is something that both obviously retains the sense of the material substance, of also the material history of the medium that you're working with. And I think contemporary artists are very interested right now in thinking about this. I mean, it's interesting that the future is very much about obsolescence in some way right now. So it's very much about thinking about the archaeological layers of the mediums that come through the surface, or how they can be materialized in the kind of material history that is expressed on the surface. And going all the way back, I mean, I'm thinking a lot about the series of paintings on the origin of painting. And which was actually represented as a Corinthian woman drew a silhouette on a wall that you can also always see, because there's a candle that is making a kind of projection, in a sense, on the wall. So she draws the figure of her lover on the wall to remember him. And at the same time, it's this particular kind of projection that comes through the shadow that is made as the candle illuminates the surface of the wall, which becomes a canvas, which becomes a screen. So when I'm talking about contemporary art, and I'm talking about the way in which the canvas are becoming more like walls, because they're thick in layers, and then at the same time walls are becoming lighter, like screens, and there is a relation between canvas, wall, and screen that I see coming together in contemporary art. I'm looking at a future, but I'm also looking at a future which is very much about the origin of painting, because the origin of painting was drawing on the wall, making a screen out of the projection of light and a candle, and at the same time it was the first canvas. So there you have canvas, wall, and screen, really at the very, very beginning of the origin of painting itself, and all the way today that seems to be an intersection that happens on the surface that connects these three elements together in very, very interesting ways, by way of light very often.
So I think that we should finish, but I would not resist to make you a last question.
Okay.
And I think it's more than a question, it's the notion that you bring now, that the difference, because surfaces are places where I project and are places where I represent. So there is this autonomy in all surfaces between projection and surfaces and representation. Do you think that you have any drive from one of them, or do you think that the both can live with?
No, I mean, I tend to be interested in this idea of projection more these days than representation, but I'm not doing away with representation. I know that a number of people are, they can definitely coexist, but in this book of surfaces, I'm really, really thinking a lot about the idea of projection, partly because of what I was mentioning before that has to do with light, and the way in which, in a way, we can only read a surface because it is hit by light. If we turned everything dark in the studio, there'd be no more surfaces, right? And surfaces are activated by light. We see things differently on our skins, on canvases, on walls, on screens, depending on how the light hits the surface. It's the most important thing that exists. So the light is the major form, in a sense, of existence of this particular mode that is the surface. And of course, it's essential for screens. So everything lit from behind, lit from above, it's the most important thing in a way that has been the least thought about, because when people talk about cinema, they talk about the representation, the film. But what about this light? What about the white screen? What about the connection between the light and the surface? So in surface matters of aesthetics, materiality, and media, I have a lot about materiality, a lot about media, and a lot about light. There's 3 chapters on light, and the way in which light, which is not considered a surface, makes every surface possible, and this notion of projection, how it's becoming central. And I'm thinking for the future more about the idea of projection, and why is it that at the turn of the last century, Freud came up with the idea of projection at the same time as the moving images were invented. So there's something really interesting about the beginning of modernity and the beginning of modern languages, in a way, dealing with this notion of projection and how important it is today. Obviously, we don't seem to be able to do without it. And it's an interesting notion because, like the surface, projection is something that means it's spelling out. And so has the same root of emotion. It's something that comes out. The projector has a throw of light. It's something that ejects out, and at the same time, when it hits the surface, it's something that makes you understand this relation between inside and outside. So in some way, light, projection, interior and exterior are really the center of the way in which modern visuality was materially organized. So that to me is really the form of materiality, is a very virtual, very ethereal sense. It's light.
Okay, thank you very much for this so insightful interview. I think it was more than an interview, it was a thought experiment that we have the opportunity to have. And in behalf of the direction of the School of Arts, Architecture and Film Studies and Information Technology, I would like to thank you again for coming.
Thank you.
And we hope that we have another opportunity to have you here again.
Thank you.